So again, I'll just say welcome and bienvenue and anin to all of you who have joined us in the room. We are thrilled to be welcoming you to the Climate-Kind Pedagogy webinar today. My name is Hilary Inwood, and I am here wearing a couple of different hats. I'm wearing my Ontario Institute for Studies and Education hat, which is part of the Faculty of Ed from the University of Toronto. We are one of the groups that are sponsoring today's webinar. We work in close partnership with the Toronto District School Board, with the Eco Schools team and the Sustainability Office. I'm really happy to welcome three members of that team here today: Chris Metropolis, Jen Vetter, and Elisa Roberge. I'm also happy to welcome the team from Accelerate, Climate Change Education and Canadian Teacher Education. I'm one of the co-leads on that project, along with my colleague Ellen Field and our very valuable and trusted colleague Marie Tremblay, who's in the room today too. So, and then I just want to give a special shout out to Sarah Urquhart, who is our webinar coordinator. Sarah does all of the work in the back end of these webinars, and Sarah, we're so appreciative of all of the work you do with us at OISE and with the TDSB. So with that, we're going to get underway. We're really pleased again to have you here today. This is what you can expect over the next hour. We're going to be welcoming and introducing our keynote speaker, Kshamta Hunter, in just a sec, but we always do start with a land acknowledgement. Today's land acknowledgement is an interesting one in that we've chosen an artist from BC in honor of our speaker, who is joining us from British Columbia today. This logo, which is designed by youth artist Gordy Dick from Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, which is located on unceded territory centered on Burrard Inlet between Maplewood Flats and Deep Cove in North Vancouver. Gordy was 13 when he designed this image 2 years ago. And he said of the image, one of the hands represents Indigenous humans, and then the other side is other races. The circle is the earth, and the eagles are our ancestors, those who walked before us. The design in the eagle's wings represents a water pattern, the ripple effect. This reminded me of the impact, or the ripple effects, if you will, of kindness in relationship to climate change education, which is the focus of today's talk by Kshamta Hunter. Kindness to kin, both human and the more than human, is essential during times of climate crisis, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss, and offers the potential to help us shift towards sociocultural and ecological regeneration. So with that, I'll give you the TDSB's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And we recognize, of course, as a group, that land acknowledgements are not enough in their own right. It's really how we enact them that's the most important part. So I ask you to consider that as we're going through today's webinar in terms of how you might enact notions of climate kindness in your own professional and personal lives. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Kshamta Hunter's research explores intersections of sustainability learning and leadership using transformative learning and social innovation frameworks. She's interested in designing responsive and relevant integrative curricular and pedagogical approaches for the 21st century through understanding the development of competencies for innovation towards sustainability. She's a lecturer in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy and manager of transformative learning and student engagement with the UBC Sustainability Hub, where she's able to shape a lot of her research ideas into practice. She's an associate editor for the International Journal of Sustainability in Higher Education, a member of the first External Advisory Committee for Canada's 2030 Agenda, member of the Board of Directors for the Falls Creek Society, and recipient of the 2023 President's Service Award for Excellence at the University of British Columbia. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Kshamta to share hers, and just know that we're really grateful for you to come in to share your ideas and your approaches to climate change education today, Kshamta, with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for that introduction and for the land acknowledgement. Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here and presenting some of this work that we've been working on from last about 2 years. So here is a quick agenda before I am just going to move so I can see my screen. Just to give you a bit of a backgrounder, this work was initially inspired by Kindness Project group, which is a group of transdisciplinary network of faculty, staff, and students and community individuals who come together and really want to talk about having kindness integrated into academia specifically. Um, and this idea of climate education and kindness came out of those conversations. We applied for a fund at UBC here at the University of British Columbia. It's called the Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund to develop this pedagogical framework. And I'm going to present some of the outcomes from last 2 years of this work. Um, a little bit of an agenda, so I'll present a bit of a background of what, why, how, a brief overview of the pedagogical framework, and I'll talk a little bit about various aspects of this framework, from foundational values to educator attributes, syllabus planning, activities, tools, and evaluation strategies, and then just end with a bit of a summary takeaway. So I'll start with a bit of a land acknowledgement of myself. I would like to acknowledge that I am here joining you from the lands of the traditional owners and caretakers who are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Musqueams, Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I also like to acknowledge that you are joining us from various traditional territories and like to acknowledge their owners and caretakers as well. One of the things that the pedagogy, the CKP or Climate-Kind Pedagogy focuses on is really bringing in values-based approaches into everything that we are doing in our classrooms. One of them is land acknowledgement. And so one of the things that we do, that we have tried in various settings at post-secondary, but also in K to 12, is really think about the three concepts or the terminologies that we use to acknowledge the land, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded. And I ask my students, what comes to your mind when you think about the word traditional? From your personal perspective, in terms of what kind of values, what kind of feelings, what kind of places, what kind of people, or what kind of traditions or festivities come to mind when you think about these words? Um, and then thinking about how do you then bring those notions, those perceptions into the land acknowledgement that you do. So I can maybe answer some more questions about this later on because we may not have the time to really engage with this at this moment, but I would love to engage with this more if there is interest. Um, so thinking about when we started thinking about climate change and the climate crisis and these converging crises in terms of climate change, but also destabilization, including heat waves or pollution or forest fires, floods, social unrest, including conflicts and war, inequities, food insecurity, pandemic, as well as ongoing systemic racism that has enhanced this idea of that we cannot really overlook how we approach teaching and learning. Educators are faced with this challenge every day in terms of bringing these challenges and these crisis conversations into a classroom, but also navigating through the emotional complexities that they're facing, that their students are facing as well. So CKP is really an idea that how can we bring some of the approaches that have been successful in practice and bring them to educators so that they are well equipped to bring these conversations into these classrooms. So what I'm presenting here is nothing new. The approach might be a little bit different. So what we did about a year and a half, 2 years ago was that looked into some of the frameworks, climate related, but as well as some of the kindness related frameworks that already exist and have been in practice. So we looked at climate education framework, for example, and climate change education framework, ESD, education for sustainability, environmental education. And then we also looked at eco-pedagogy, but also pedagogies of kindness, care, trauma-informed, embodied pedagogies, and resilient pedagogies. So we looked at these frameworks and using appreciative inquiry, really wanted to focus in on what is working. instead of working on the gaps and things that are not necessarily working out in practice. So we really wanted to focus in on those aspects of what is common between these frameworks and what has been successful. What we found was these sort of four broad concepts. This idea of constructivism, that knowledge is constructed and is based in previous knowledge and personal and social activity. So, this idea that students construct knowledge based on their previous knowledge, and the reality is determined by those lived experiences. Basically, learners use their previous knowledge as a foundation and build on those narratives. This idea of foundational values, so those are the key values that we found were very present in most of these frameworks that we looked at. Kindness being one of those emergent ones that were very common across most of the frameworks. Not necessarily explicitly, but more implicit connotations of kindness were present in most of these frameworks. Then we looked also at reflexive pedagogy, which was also very present, which is centered around this idea of self-awareness of learning, and is focused not only on what is learned, but why it's learned, and what is to be achieved of this learning. This approach to learning supports self-reflection as a way of developing critical thinking skills as well. So we wanted to kind of keep that at the center of these conversations. And then the last one being transformative learning theory, and this idea that we need to challenge our students in our classroom, but with that support system that makes sure that they are really learning through those experiences. But transformative learning theory also sort of projects that this idea of we need to objectify the subjective elements of our being, and those being the values that we need to really interrogate and explicitly bring out value conversations into our classroom. So I'll go a little bit more into those value conversations a little bit later on. But I also wanted to kind of go into why kindness, and why bring this kindness lens into everything that we are suggesting around climate education. So this idea that kindness is not just a virtue, it is a manifestation of profound intelligence. And it's one of the highest expression of intelligence, if you speak of it. And there's a lot of mention of it in various research. Kindness is also an inter and transdisciplinary tactic for intellectual community building, which is not to say that, not to be confused with leniency. And it's not, and I would like to differentiate between niceness and kindness. I can be kind without being nice, and I will dive into that a little bit later on as well. So, and we also found in literature that there's a positive and beneficial effect on the learning environment and the outcomes for learners when educators adopt a teaching philosophy based on pedagogy of kindness. And there's strong links between being an exemplary educator and adopting a teaching philosophy that uses kindness, empathy, and care in its pedagogy. So, really, this idea that we need to and should kindness should play a valuable role in the pedagogy to influence learners' environment, outcomes, teaching success, and promote discourse on social justice as well. And I will dive a little bit more into the social justice part. Um, so when we were thinking about climate-kind pedagogy, we really found that there's the two main buckets of like really this idea of compassion, and centralizing compassion rather than empathy. And empathy is, of course, that you're understanding another perspective, or you are trying to be in their shoes. But compassion kind of takes it a step further. Compassion is empathy plus action. So this idea that you are feeling what the other person is going through, but you're trying to take an action. or do something about it. So while empathy refers more generally to our ability to take the perspective and feel the emotion of another person, compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. And it's a skill. So how do we build those skills of action and feeling and action in our students through various teaching and learning experiences? Um, and then other idea of this idea that students are people first and students second. So how do we encourage that person-centered, learner-centered approaches? Another aspect of kindness pedagogy is believing people and believing in people. So this idea that students are could be reliant and they can take ownership of their own learning, and we need to be able to empower and trust them in that ability. Kindness pedagogy is also committed to social justice and it's concerned with the matter of race, gender, culture, age, and religion, and really emphasizes this idea of inclusion and empowerment of students from various cultural backgrounds and bringing those cultural knowledges as valid knowledges in the learning and teaching experiences. And the second bucket is this idea that we need to see a culture shift. We need to see a culture shift because education hasn't been really what we want it to be. Like Dr. David Orr says, education, most of the crisis that we are seeing is the result of the acts of the most educated people in the world. So how do we then change the narrative around education so that it's not repeating the decades of work that has been done, and we are kind of shifting that narrative. So that culture shift of implementing the pedagogy of kindness requires teachers to change their teaching approach from control to relationship building, and dismantling the hierarchies and normalizing challenge. And normalizing challenge in a way that I can challenge the students because I don't have to be nice, but in a kind way, I can still offer that challenge and support in the classroom, and changing that through the culture shift and making that part of the learning community in the classroom. It challenges learners to see beyond their existing worldviews, to appreciate and value self and others, and teachers are as facilitators in that co-construction of knowledge. Um, I will move a little bit into the foundational values because these are the key sort of values that we saw common in most of the frameworks that we looked at. So the idea behind for the pedagogy then became, how do we enact these values? And especially using this idea of transformative learning, how do we objectively interrogate these values into our teaching and learning? So how do we enact and uphold them in practice? Um, so I would urge you to think about and also creating these conversations into your classroom, right? I mean, bringing these conversations in to discuss it with your students. What do you think of kindness? How have you experienced kindness? And what are some of the acts of kindness that you would like to see that will make your teaching and learning experience in this classroom better? So we looked at some of the ideas, and we have collected some data in the past 2 years of what students are responding to. And I'll give you just one example that I did not actually think about. It's an act of kindness. I mean, I try and integrate that, or I do integrate that, but I didn't relate it to kindness. So students reported that when teachers or our instructors or facilitators use their pronouns without them sort of encouraging them to do it, that's an act of kindness. And that was really interesting to me that that use of pronouns is connected to this act of kindness, which is very interesting. Another way of doing it is doing those in-class check-ins and starting those classes with a really quick check-in question of how you're doing. Grounding exercises are really, or meditative exercises, breathing exercises are a good way to start and kind of integrating those acts of kindness in the classroom as well. And so is a similar thing for other values in terms of justice, trust, and resilience. And there is a website that where all of these are listed, so which I'll offer at the end of the presentation as well. Um, in terms of equity, like really ensuring the teachings are culturally responsive to the students. And how do you bring that into your classroom is through really knowing your students and where they're coming from and their perspectives and perceptions of various learning outcomes that you're thinking of covering in your class. In terms of the teacher or educator attributes, we found that really having that welcoming and open environment is really celebrated by students, and they can really tell if you are developing a place where they can feel safe. That is trauma informed, where their ideas and their perspectives are honored and celebrated. Um, Reducing that idea of power and hierarchies or dismantling hierarchies. So having those explicit conversations of power, privilege, and positionalities is really important. And that goes from all K to 12 to post-secondary. I've had these power privilege conversations with grade one and twos, and then I have these conversations with post-secondary students, and they are very similar. And it's very interesting that young students really understand these ideas of power and privilege, and they are wanting to have more and more of these conversations. Um, One of the places where we collected some data on climate-kind pedagogy was in a climate camp, where we offered the climate camp to high school students. And in one of the focus groups, a lot of students actually reported that we need to have more of these conversations in their classrooms, that they are experiencing power and privilege narratives and situations in their schools, but the teachers are not having those conversations. So they really wanted their teachers to have these conversations of power and privilege and classism and racism and sexism. In terms of syllabus and planning, there were a few things that we found. One of the major ones was this idea of co-creation and how can, as educators and facilitators, really involve students in our syllabus planning or curriculum planning. And it's easier said than done. I've tried it and I've not been hugely successful because I teach classes that are 6 weeks or 7 weeks long, and it's hard to integrate that co-creation aspect to the level that I would like it to be. But there are other ways of doing it in terms of collaboration, inquiry-driven approaches, and also making flexibility a really huge part of your classroom. So having assignments, due dates flexible, depending on individual cases. Assignments could be, I usually have students choose the way they want to present their assignment. Would it be PowerPoint? Would it be written assignment? Could it be a skit? Could it be a walk in the park or going outside and then they just showcase what they have done? So it really kind of puts a lot of empowerment on students in terms of how they would like to display their knowledge. In terms of activities, we found self-reflection was a huge part of most of the frameworks through weekly journals, writing prompts, experiential learning, so having those role plays. And students really appreciate taking a perspective of a different stakeholder. So in terms of like, having a case study on a climate change, for example, and taking a perspective of a government of Canada, for the federal government or provincial government, or even a resident or an environmental expert. And they really like taking those roles and taking those perspectives and researching and presenting them into a debate, for example. Problem-based learning, so really examining those real climate issues, bringing, for example, LA fires as they are experiencing or listening to those in the news. Nature and land-based learning, going outside and doing those journals, outside reflection exercises, debates and discussions are hugely like the students just love engaging in those. and community engagement, and if you can really work with a community partner on a project where students can work with a community partner on a community project, that's where students really will thrive. Um, Also having more values activities. So one of the activities that I do, and I'll give you a really quick example of this, is how to explicitly bring those values conversation. Is that I kind of talk about what values are, have that discussion, and then they have to choose their top 2 to 3 core values. Um, after some reflection, and then they usually get into their groups or working groups, and they share their values, and then they have to compromise and come up with their top 2 or 3 group values, and how would these values be integrated into the project that they are doing, and explicitly thinking about how would they uphold those values, but also how would they integrate them into the project and the solutions that they are working on. Um, I'll give you also an example of another, and you may have done this in your own classes. And in the last 2 years of research, this is the activity that students of all ages just absolutely love engaging in. And it's taking a stand. So you present a prompt, and it's a great way to engage and learn about various perspectives in the classroom, and how do people really uphold those perspectives and debate on various positions that they are taking. So it's called a spectrum activity, and usually students can stand in the classroom, and then they kind of position themselves on the spectrum. So in this case, to feed our growing population, we must use all agricultural means to increase farm yields, even if some of those practices damage the environment. So mostly people kind of take their position, and usually you would see a pretty good distribution, depending on your classroom, of course. But students then have to kind of engage in conversations and kind of defend their position. And mind you, I mean, you would think that some of these conversations could be pretty complex, and students might not be comfortable in taking a stance. But I have done this in K-12 and post-secondary, and students just absolutely love engaging in these kinds of conversations. So I would encourage you to bring these in your classroom. But of course, putting that code of conduct, community agreement before, in terms of how do you engage in these conversations, and how would you like to learn and be respected. Another one I've done is individual action versus industries. And this is a great one because you would get a whole spectrum, people from all over the spectrum here, and there's a lot of learning happening as people are sharing their perspectives. In terms of tools, we kind of highlighted 2 here in terms of taking those non-Western sources of knowledge. So introducing content that really reflects diversity, and then also using various formats, and in presenting the knowledge, but also in the assignments that you want your students to display their knowledge on. So offering students those choice in assignment, how to present their learning. Um, in terms of evaluation strategy, we, of course, and I'm sure that most of you do bring a lot of these in your own engagements as well. So really designing those evaluations that are person-centered, and that incorporate that self-reflection piece, and bring those lived experiences, and having that capacity to bring those lived experiences into perspective, having those reflexive activities as well, and offering that choice and flexibility in designing that what students would like to offer. And just wanting to in summary, uh, a lot of the pedagogy is all about these 5 Cs. So compassion, this idea that compassion is a skill. Um, It's how care is given through relationship-based empathy, respect and dignity. It can also be described as an intelligent kindness through offering intentional, compassionate spaces. So have making sure that you are actually building those that culture and those spaces of compassionate where compassionate skills could be developed. Um, where you can have some honest conversations with students as well. This idea of not being nice but kind, where you are trying to help them grow through into their full potential. Creating that space and culture of kindness and flourishing is really important through those compassionate spaces as well. One of the things that are a few ways that you can do that is through kindness, grounding exercises, building those values clarification exercises at the beginning of the classroom where students really get to know each other. Developing a community agreement, for example, and really setting those realistic expectations at the beginning. Connection is a big part of this. So really building those relationships through one-on-one conversations. And I appreciate that we are always running out of time, but even having that 10 to 15-minute conversation with a student one-on-one will really highlight and expose a lot of things that will never be up into perspective if you're always in a group setting. Um, so it's really important part of climate-kind pedagogy. And this clarification of roles that I'm not an expert. I don't know all the answers. I'm a facilitator of learning, and I'm here to learn together is a really big part of that culture, developing that culture. Co-construction rather than telling. So really building this idea of that students are able to take ownership of their own learning. And a lot of the time, students are not trying to get out of doing work. They are there to learn. And if given the chance, they will take up that challenge in different ways. And then speaking of challenge, that really idea of normalizing challenge and how do we do that through various experiences, but also making sure that that challenge isn't too much for various personality types in your own classroom. Um, and really discussing those ideas of how we want to learn together at the very beginning of community building exercise. So compassionate connection, clarification of role, co-construction, and then challenging or normalizing challenge are a big part of this pedagogy. I will end there, but I will also share this climateeducation.ca is where most of this information is at, all the things that we have found in the research in last 2 years. And I'm happy to answer questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Shamta. I've just popped a little reminder to people. You can either pop your questions into the chat or you can put your virtual hand up and we'd be happy to hear your questions. We love hearing your voices, just for the record. You've raised so many interesting ideas here, and I can certainly see how the ideas of a climate-kind pedagogy are generally applicable, like from kindergarten all the way up through grade 12 and into higher education. I was thinking about my own students actually as you were in higher ed, as you were talking about some of these strategies. The one question I had for you was around this notion of debate. Like the take the stand makes a little more sense to me. The debate I'm struggling with a little bit only because it's often so adversarial. And I'm wondering if that's a great strategy that aligns with a climate kind approach. And if so, how do we do it in a way that's compassionate and kind rather than adversarial and people digging their heels in and just only seeing their side on a debate.
Yeah, I hear you. I think, and that goes back to the culture that we have developed, that you might have be developed at the beginning of the classroom. So I've never had digging heels kind of a
Mhm.
debate in those taking a stand because of the culture that we have developed at the beginning. So I wouldn't do this at the beginning of my class, but in the first two or even a week of the classes. I would probably do it the middle or the end because by then I have developed that pedagogy in the classroom in terms of how do we want to interact? How do we want to discuss? Another thing that I didn't share here, this idea of discussion versus dialogue. Discussion, I find, is convergent. You're trying to come to one consensus and you're trying to convince people of your what you believe in. In the classroom, what I usually try and do is do the dialogue first, which is divergent. Dialogue is justice oriented, is divergent because you are, without controversy, trying to put all the ideas on the table
Mm.
and listening to all the ideas. And then you go into discussion where you're trying to converge onto one idea, if you may. So dialogue first and then discussion. And we try and do that through this take the stand activity as well. Not to say that, you're trying to convince other person to come to your side of the spectrum, but it's more about why you're there. And so one example I'll give you is one of the standing activity was I like going to climate protests, and I'm comfortable going to climate protest. But when you think about people in your classroom, I have people who are coming from various countries where protest is actually dangerous.
Mm.
You cannot protest there because it's not allowed. So in that then you're listening to different perspectives and why that person is on that side of the spectrum, and that really engages people in a lot of learning.
Thank you very much. Karen Acton from Oise, one of my fantastic colleagues who I'm so thrilled to have here today. Karen, you have your hand up.
I did. And I just want to say thank you so, so much for talking about this issue. I just loved the title and I love the philosophy. In my world, I've just been digging deeper into caring leadership. There's adaptive leadership that you're supposed to be using during crisis. And I love that it has this regulating distress component to it, which a lot of leadership does not have. But I also love transformative pedagogy, especially when we're talking about sustainability issues. So I was very intrigued by your frameworks that you use to create your new Climate-Kind. And I just wondered if you could help me in my own mind for my own work. There's transformational pedagogy or transformative pedagogy, which really overlapped with a lot of the slides that you had already. So I'm going to ask you if you had to pull out that extra component of climate kindness, what would you add to transformative pedagogy? What would be those magic little words or themes that you would add to it to enrich it to make it more of a kindness pedagogy?
Let me just rephrase. So what would I add to the transformative learning framework to make it more inclusive of climate kind?
That's right. To
Okay.
tell me what the succinctness is of the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main gist of the climate kind is this idea of compassion and really and I really like to break it down because compassion is a skill and it needs to be developed through practice. And I think a lot of the times similarly goes for kindness. We often sort of forget about kindness, and I think the more you practice the acts of kindness, the better you get at those. And I think this idea that, if we can introduce compassion into transformative learning is already based in constructivism and a lot of values and things like that. But this compassion piece is what I feel like might be missing. That it is a skill and that empathy is um, might be easier done than compassion. And I'm not sure exactly if that's the right framing, but I would say compassion is harder because you have to take an action. And a lot of the times we might limit ourselves to empathy because we cannot go to the next step of actually taking an action. So compassion is really key to this, I think.
Oh, I love your answer. And I did note down your little phrase that compassion equals empathy plus action. I thought that was really well done too. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to follow up on that, Alexander, I do see your hand up, but I'm just going to pop to a question in the chat because we've got questions there as well. Camille asks, can you clarify the difference between kindness and niceness?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Niceness is sort of a little bit based more on the pedagogy of care, which is really getting to know the person at the very individual level, and love is really big part of that care pedagogy, which is great. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't go there. But I think a lot of the times in practice, especially if you have a class of like post-secondary, you're thinking of class of hundreds sometimes in first year. And to apply that pedagogy of care is really becomes really onerous. Whereas kindness is more about culture shift. So you are trying to develop a community of learning where you are trusting in people's ability to create that community of learning. Whereas in niceness, I might not be able to be, I guess, honest with you because I'm trying to be nice. Whereas in kindness, I can be honest because I want you to be to kind of develop into your full potential. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's the kindness you can challenge people, whereas in niceness you might not be able to challenge.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that made sense to me. I'm hoping it did too, Camille. Alexander, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Kshamta, for a fascinating presentation. I was particularly um, impressed by your pedagogy because it puts values first. I really like that. And such an important factor that influences agency and behavior more than intelligence or learning or understanding. Um, Anyway, you mentioned a whole bunch of what I would call virtues in your pedagogy: kindness, compassion, justice, equity, relationships, interactions, and so on. And and quite often you also you mentioned the word people. And the question rose in me quite early on: who are people? To whom do all these virtues actually relate and apply? Is it really just Homo sapiens? Between the lines, I'm sort of hearing it's mostly Homo sapiens, but surely not exclusively. Anthropocentrism is not so unquestioned as it used to be. Could you clarify to what extent you apply all these virtues to non-human organisms, to species, to ecosystems, to entities like entire watersheds? Those are now being discussed as possible candidates.
Yeah. And I'm sorry that if I missed that. So I do mean human and more than human, for sure. Those virtues are relatable to all of them. But I think we as humans need to apply it more to us because the more than human are, especially if you talk about nature and nature's privileges. I mean, I don't know if I agree, and maybe I shouldn't share this, but I do agree with the with this idea of personhood to natures because to the bodies of water and all of that. And I think that's doing we are trying to protect those entities in nature because through that idea. But it does put humans at the top of the hierarchy. And if you're not a person, then you don't have those privileges, those rights. And I don't know if I completely agree with that. So in that sense, I would kind of backtrack and say those virtues do apply to all, but more so on humans at this point than more than humans. But our approach of integrating those virtues and those values will impact more than human world.
Though I'll have to counter that just a little bit, in that I think I've learned more about compassion and empathy from dogs, more than I have sometimes from other humans. So
Yeah, no,
I'm a
that's true.
little
And I
voted for my
completely agree.
canine friends modeling kindness for sure.
And that's why I say the humans, we as humans need it more than need to practice it more than human world.
Absolutely. So we've got a question from Anastasia in the chat, and Anastasia says, as a leader striving to support science education and climate education, and she's doing this, by the way, in Puget Sound region of Greater Seattle. How do you imagine implementing this approach in K-5 education, given real constraints, increasingly so given our political reality? And that is true. We've had a pretty big shift yesterday on that front, Anastasia. So if our youth are not receiving climate education, are their futures not already being foreclosed? So how do we bring this into public school classrooms?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I was a little bit depressed yesterday, to be honest, even though I knew it was coming. But I think that's the difference between, and we don't have to call it climate kind pedagogy. We can call it whatever you want, but it's really the approach, right? It's the idea that you are introducing skills for your students to enact these values and these virtues in their behavior. And once they're there, then everything is included, right? They don't like, of course, climate education is very important and we should be integrated, but it's the approach of how you want to look at nature and how do you want to. So, for example, one of the core values that I hold, and this is the conversation that I usually have with my students, is like, what are your core values? And I usually give an example of respect as being one of my core values. And when you hold and enact that value, it's everywhere. If you go in nature, you will respect nature and you will make sure that it's left the way that you found it and or even better. And if the same goes for care or kindness, it's how you are applying that in your own teaching and learning. Um, I would say climate education is very, very important, especially now that we are in this existential crisis. But we can bring that in various ways, integrated through science, through socials, through math, through English, and really giving that ownership to students as well in terms of how they want to learn and engage with this.
Thank you very much, Shamta. Ellen, got a question for Shamta?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Hi, Shanta. Thanks for the presentation. As I was listening, I was very much appreciative of the framework and the pedagogical approach, and also love the inclusion of debate and sort of deliberative dialogue around the issues. And so I think we could talk a lot about that, actually. But what I wanted to ask you about is, are you aware or have you started to think about research that can show climate kindness pedagogy as sort of a proof of concept? So whether there's strong evidence of some of the outcomes, because I can see it being critiqued among certain groups that would have particular agendas, right? And so I'm just sort of wondering if you have some of that research or if you know of others who are looking at that type of evidence base. And specifically thinking about like Casey Bush's 2019 article that really showed that it's not knowledge that's going to really determine some of the outcomes that young people will take outside of their learning. It's the social norms of the classroom and so I cite that reference all the time. And so I'm always looking for those pieces of research that can help us move practice. So do you know of some or that you can share?
Yeah, and I think that's where we are trying to make a case of here, that it's the pedagogy, it's the how rather than what, that makes all the difference. And yes, there is critique, and one of the biggest is that you are being too soft when you are approaching everything with kindness. And I think that's where I tend to differ and try and differentiate between niceness and kindness. That I can still be very firm and challenge students on their, either on where they're standing, or even if they cannot submit an assignment on time, I can have that honest conversation with them, and really try and understand where they're coming from, and then make those individual case by case situations. Um, so there are critiques, but so far, uh, I I've been collecting data in the courses that I'm teaching, but also a couple of other instructors. We've been collecting data through a leadership program at UBC as well, and through the climate camp that we offer to high school students. And so far, from the students' perspective, it's been hugely successful. And like, students are very clear that this is the approach they want, because they feel like, especially for climate education, what I'm hearing from the data that we have collected so far is that there is a lot of uh, problems or issues or sort of hopelessness narrative around climate, that this is the problem and the problem is increasing, and the problem is huge. But there isn't much of like, okay, but here is the support. Like, we can do this, and here's the community of people who are wanting to do it together with you. That's the piece that's missing. And in fact, in the last climate camp, the students actually wanted their parents and teachers to take the climate camp. They were like, "Is there a climate camp for our parents and teachers?" because I think they need to hear this too. So that was really interesting, and in terms of the need for it and demand for it, it's there. Um, but I think it's hard sometimes. The culture shift is hard. And I mean, I'm thinking about environmental education. It's like 50 or 60 years old, and we are still working on it. So it's going to take time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is going to take time. And I had popped into the chat earlier that the TDSB is offering, in fact, a climate camp for teachers each summer. We started last summer in our first year. We'll be doing it again this year. Kshamta and I have already been talking about how we learn from each other's climate camps. Hers were on the student side, and ours on the teacher's side. And I think you're absolutely right that that notion of relationality, of building strong networks of people, of educators who are doing the work and who can learn from each other in the work, is so incredibly important. It's certainly the approach that the TDSB's Eco Schools program has always taken, and has really supported over the years, and really helping to position teachers as leaders in the work, but leaders need support as well, right? I'm thinking back to Karen Acton's comments a little bit earlier in terms of the leadership piece. There's no doubt that teachers can absolutely help to support, can be supported and help others, support others to do this work. Did that answer your question, Ellen? Okay, great, excellent. Question from JD in the chat, and we've got just a couple more minutes to, if anybody else has other questions they wanted to ask Kshamta. The question from JB: thank you for sharing your research. When you speak of normalizing challenges, I'm struggling to understand what this looks like in practice. How would a teacher operationalize this? Is this about equipping learning to engage in safe risk-taking and working with students to see failure as a natural part of learning?
Absolutely. Risk-taking and failure. I think we need to learn how to fail and learn from those failures, and not make failures as such a bad thing. I think the most learning happens when we fail and do it again. So I think that's a really, really important part of this. Bringing one of the ways that I have effectively normalized challenge in some of my classrooms is bringing in some socio-scientific issues. So talking about climate change, but talking about, for example, abortions or organ transplant or those issues that really get to the crux of complexities and where science and social sort of kind of merge in a very complex and messy way, and really kind of having those conversations with students, challenging their norms and their perspectives and their values. And I think it's good to bring those challenges. Students have reported that they like to talk about those challenging issues in their classroom. They are not shying away from this. And I think most of the times as educators, we feel unequipped and sort of, not comfortable bringing those issues. But I think and like, I mean, even Catherine Hale was talking about, how we really need to be okay, kind of as scientists, be okay to not be neutral, and be okay to say that these are our values and this is why I believe in them, and be able to defend them, but also be able to listen to other side and other perspectives and be able to change them if needed. So those are some really good ways of bringing those challenges. And like taking a stand activity is a great way to start those conversations.
Thank you. I think I've gotten all the questions in the chat. So at this point, we're just about at 5 o'clock anyway. So I'm just going to express our gratitude to Kshamta for really, I have a sister who does a lot of work in the kindness field, and I do work in climate change education, and yet I had never thought about bringing those two together, even though there are absolutely clear connections between the two. So Kshamta, thanks for connecting the dots for us, and for introducing this approach. And I know this will become a topic at our climate camp and other workshops and webinars that we're leading moving forward. So thank you so much for your innovation and for sharing your ideas with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining too. Thank you, Hillary.
We had a couple of questions in the chat about what other upcoming events have we got going, and Sarah has also just triggered the exit poll. So before you leave, if you can do the exit poll, we always appreciate giving our speakers feedback from you in terms of what they've gotten out of it today. There's 3 upcoming events we can speak of. This is just for February and March. Sarah had mentioned in the chat that the best way to stay abreast of TDSB learning events coming up is to absolutely join the EcoSchools newsletter. So I encourage you to do that. From those of you who are joined from OISE today, we really appreciate it if you join the SCAN listserv for the same reason, and you'll get from us at OISE once a week update on what's happening that week. And from the TDSB team, they send out a once a month newsletter at the start of the month listing everything that's going on. And there is a lot. The EcoSchools team are very active, and we're really appreciative of all the work that they do to help support teachers' professional learning when it comes to climate change education and environmental and sustainability ed more broadly. So those are the ones that are coming up for this next month. And Kshamta, you'll be interested to know that Elizabeth Lange is coming to speak to our higher ed group, our community of practice at the University of Toronto, on transformative approaches to teaching and learning, in fact, and thinking forward to the Symbiocene in March 7th. We're going to have some principals talking about their perspectives on climate change education. This follows up on a meeting we had just last week with a very large number of principals and vice principals from the TDSB who are very interested in supporting this work. We were thrilled about that. And then if you're interested in the EcoSchools workshops that are taking place in Central Tech for specifically TDSB teachers on February 14th, I guess that would be the TDSB EcoSchools gift of love to teachers on February 14th on Valentine's Day. And you can get that information from the EcoSchools newsletter, or you can reach out to one of the EcoSchools teams as part of that as well. So Kshamta, once again, thank you so much for all of your work in this field and for sharing your ideas with us today. We really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us, everybody. Lovely to have you in the room with us today.